Batman Caped Crusader may just be one of the most anticipated Batman shows of all time. Announced all the way back in 2021, with some notable names attached behind the scenes, being developed by one half of the team that brought the world Batman the Animated Series and the new Batman Adventures. In partnership with Matt Reeves, the man who brought the world the Batman, as well as J.J. Abrams, who is just J.J. Abrams. Those are some pretty well-regarded creators working together on a series 2 out of 3 of them already have a tie to. Before a teaser trailer ever dropped, it was being touted as the second coming of Batman the Animated Series, so it had some pretty big boots to fill right off the bat. Pardon the pun. But boy did it fill them. Caped Crusader is a well-written, well-thought-out series. Each episode, when viewed on its own, feels like an individual story, but when watched together, each story reads more like a chapter of a much bigger story. The characters are constantly progressing and fulfilling arcs, further developing as people, and the show overall is just narratively satisfying. Batman the Caped Crusader is all about Batman, the Caped Crusader. But that doesn't mean it stops at Bruce Wayne. More important than the man behind the mask is the myth that this mask creates. How he affects others, who he influences, who he inspires, and what it is that he inspires them to do. With the birth of Batman comes an influx of costumed criminals, the likes of which Gotham had never seen before, save for maybe Firebug. So many Gothamites blame him for their sudden appearances. We see the general public's response to the vigilante, the general dysfunction and confusion that follows the hero. Citizens of the city don't know what to make of their new guardian. Sometimes the civilians he protects loathe him, and sometimes the criminals he's protecting them from love him. Despite his heroic actions and attempts at saving the day, or I guess more accurately night, the GCPD look to take him in, partially due to the fact that despite his good deeds, his means of achieving them doesn't exactly make him a law-abiding citizen. But it's also due to the fact that a lot of the city's corruption has made way for crooked cops with connections to the mob. The show feels like an ensemble, following Gotham's most important figures and central characters. With this divided attention, Batman himself isn't always who the viewers are following. A lot of the time we're shown the character in intervals, seeing how he plays into the current case. This allows Batman to lurk in the shadows, and I think that greatly adds to the mystique of the character rather than having the titular character overexposed to its audience. It's an ideal circumstance for the Caped Crusader, because now the audience is seeing him the same way those he encounters would. We're granted some familiarity with the story's face, but not a whole lot of face time, and not a whole lot of familiarity. This series is the story of something old, something new. So let's start with the former and make our way over to the latter. The new Batman show is a throwback to the classic Caped Crusader from the comics, hence its title. The show brings Batman back to his roots, as it recreates his original comic run. The series is set in the 1940s, which are the very years that saw the Dark Knight's debut. The designs are not only indicative of the time period it takes place in, but they're also almost all too accurate for what it is that they're adapting, with even the Batcave being returned to its original state. The characters especially look like they were plucked straight out of the panels of Detective Comics, with Batman's cape and cowl being identical to his first appearance. Now, this look has been referenced a lot in Batman moving media, but it has never been the character's primary costume in any of it. So this first on-screen look was a long time coming, but it was also well worth the wait, much like the show that it's a part of. The villains Batman comes up against are also from the Vigilante's early Rogues Gallery. Catwoman dons the same outfit she first appeared in, albeit with a color scheme that more so matches later incarnations. The Clayface shown in the show is Basil Karlo, who is the first Clayface from the comics, and he's got the appropriate attire to prove it. We see the origins of Two-Face, who we'll get into in a minute. Even Flash villain the Gentleman Ghost surprisingly has an episode dedicated to him. All of these characters were from the 1940s, but while an emphasis is definitely put on the past, it's not just that it's praising. There is no hard rule regarding that, as the show also sees the likes of Lucius Fox, Firebug, and Harvey Bullock, who showed up in the 70s. Then they have Harley Quinn and Renee Montoya, who got their start in the 90s, and Onomatopoeia, who was created in the early 2000s. Additionally, Alfred Pennyworth is looking a lot more plump these days, which is a throwback to his first incarnation, Alfred Beagle, feeling like a loving hybrid between where the character started and how far it's come. Alfred desperately tries to plead with Bruce, but he's so consumed in being Batman, he hardly acknowledges his friend, or even that he is in fact a friend. Catwoman is a wealthy socialite turned jewel thief, just as she once was before, but it seems she's more of a second-generation brat who's coasted off her father's accomplishments, by which I mean crimes. Clayface is once again an over-the-top thespian. Now, in the comics originally, he was a successful actor driven mad by a remake of his classic film, so he took to the nights killing off the cast and crew. He didn't have the classic Clayface abilities, though he would be given them at a later point in time. This time around, Basil Karlo is a semi-successful actor who could never be a leading man due to his looks, so he undergoes an experimental treatment to give him the face of a star. Instead, it winds up giving him the ability to mold himself to look like anybody he chooses. And because he's such a great actor, he can easily imitate the voices of those he mimics. Unfortunately, his narcissism makes for an imperfect performance, because rather than convey how those he acts as truly feel, he uses them as ventriloquist dummies, letting his voice and his own thoughts come from their mouths. It makes it all that much more eerie when this man uses his victims to sing his own praises. Ultimately, this feels like an amalgamation between the classic Clayface and the Clayface mythos that followed, and I love it for that. Most of the characters that are pulled from later iterations of Batman canon are just better adjusted and tampered with for their environment. The season's big bad isn't some supervillain, but rather the current kingpin of Gotham City's criminal underworld. He's your traditional crime boss, seated in a high position of power, and like Caesar, willing to do whatever it takes to keep that seat of power, having rival politicians in his back pocket just in case. He's the same as he's always been, except maybe now he seems a little bit more traditional and, well, time appropriate. Renee Montoya is also largely still the same. She's an extremely motivated detective with a passion for the pursuit of justice. One of the few good cops on the force who is seemingly incorruptible. James Gordon's most trusted colleague. So, same as always. And just now she wears fedoras and trench coats. No changes were made, but there really wasn't a necessity for them. The only thing that seems to be different is now there's more of a focus put on her, going from being a good background character in previous shows to being great front and center here. We aren't given a whole lot of time with Commissioner Gordon this season, but we get just enough of an impression of him to know that he's still the same force of good he's always been, although maybe his mentality regarding criminals could best be described as old school. His morality is tested when he's given the opportunity to take in the vigilante that he's been raked over the coals for not catching, or alternatively aiding him in saving the lives of 3 children stuck inside a burning apartment building. And as always, our guy makes the right choice. On the subject of cops, Caped Crusader also hosts what I think may just be the most corrupt cops any Gotham City has ever seen. A lot of the squad operate under Thorne's payroll, acting more like made men from the mob rather than law enforcement. They aid the Don in all that he does and aren't afraid of getting their hands dirty. Detective Bullock and Flass especially are examples of this, taking lives, framing others, moving people around as pawns, though one of the two seems worse than the other, as Flass is certainly the instigator in a lot of these, always goading Harvey on and suggesting he makes the worst choice possible. I can't tell if this was supposed to be an attempt at setting up some sort of redemption arc for Bullock, but given the way the season ends, I think that that's probably not going to be the case. This deceit goes much deeper than the gruesome twosome, as even officers who were once shown to be good prove to be anything otherwise later on. Past the design and depiction of certain characters, the show also takes a lot from the comics in terms of the stories that it tells, putting a heavy emphasis on the detective in World's Greatest Detective. The series takes on a very noir feel, and I am not complaining. I think it was a great idea to go back to Batman's beginnings for several reasons. For starters, this time period in the character's career is less remembered in favor of showcasing the character in his prime. And in my opinion, there's more complex, in-depth stories to tell when you have a Batman who isn't completely overpowered due to a clutter of contingency plans. More importantly, this decision gives the series its own unique identity. It's an adaptation that is all too accurate to the source. But that source, which many are familiar with today, does not fully resemble its initial source. Does that make any sense? Yeah, probably not. The mythos has evolved so much from where it started to where it is now, that a look back at the Golden Age feels foreign to fans. So in a weird way, what is old is now new. Speaking of new, there were many new changes made to certain characters. Some of these alterations don't feel like adaptations, and instead feel like new characters entirely. I don't think that every risk is necessarily rewarded. Like, there are definitely aspects I don't love, and some that I don't even like, but I love the fact that the show was willing to take these risks and try something different, rather than rehash the same stories that we've seen and heard time and time again. Perhaps the one that's changed the most in all this series is the Penguin. While plenty of the characters were race-swapped, like the Gordons and Harley Quinn, the Penguin is the only character to go through a different change. Whereas the mantle is usually held by Oswald, here it's held by Oswalda. Yet, gender-swapped Cobblepot wasn't exactly something I ever expected to see. I don't really have an opinion on it. I don't love it, and I don't hate it. I'm just overall confused by it. Out of all the characters to make such a change with, doing it with the Penguin is perhaps the most puzzling. Allegedly, the reason for this change was because Bruce Timm felt that Batman didn't have enough good villains. Which is maybe the most insane thing I've ever heard someone so deeply knowledgeable on the subject say, because Batman is pretty much renowned for having the greatest rogues gallery in hero history. If there is anything this man has an abundance of, it's great villains. Even if the point being made was that he doesn't have enough great female villains, I still don't think that's necessarily true. That's just a wild take from someone who has to know better. I still love you, Tim. I just don't agree with you. She's pretty much the same outside of that one massive change. She's a showman that hosts the Iceberg Lounge, a club to criminals and the corrupt alike. Though this time she has her sons working underneath her as her own henchmen. Yet despite these blood ties, they're just as expendable as any other henchman. Harley Quinn, a character created 50 years into the hero's legacy, is brought into the fold a little bit earlier this time around. She's also made significantly different. So different that I question why the characters even share a name. Originally, Harley Quinn was a victim victimized into being a victimizer. She was a henchwoman and love interest, if you could call it that, of the Joker. But in this telling of the tale, there is no Joker, and Harley is left to her own devices. While she shares the same occupation as the Source, what with being a psychiatrist by day and a villain by night, that's really where the comparisons end. She's not a bouncy, bubbly psychopath. She's a cold, stoic punisher. And her profession is played up much more than her previous personality, which I don't hate. As an accurate adaptation, this is so far off the mark that it's going in a different direction entirely. Even her costume looks nothing like any Harlequin that's come before her. Truth be told, I don't love this for the character, but I have come to love this character as its own unique thing. As always, she's a complex character that leads a double life. We see her as a person before we see her persona. We're shown a strong friendship between her and Barbara, a romance blossom between her and Detective Montoya, which is weird to say, but in execution I think it kinda works. In any other continuity, they would be a very confusing couple. But here, because of the changes that were made, it's a pretty interesting pairing. She's not necessarily twisted, and she's actually more moral than she's been in the past. The problem is that her moral compass is just, well, a little bit off. She means well, but she acts wicked. Despite this, she treats goodness with good, and badness with unspeakable horror. This villain's got some legs. I think that there could be some longevity with this version of the villain, so here's to hoping that we see more of her in the future. Barbara Gordon is aged up, and is made more of an equal to Batman. They're kinda colleagues in this, and given the two characters we're speaking of, and one of the men who is working on this, I really hope they just stay that way. Barbara isn't interested in wearing spandex, but she's still fighting crime, in her own way. which isn't an unheard of development for this character. She's worked in law enforcement in other stories, breaking into her father's field of work, and even at times taking over for him after he passes. But here she acts as a public defender. I would say that the character's somewhat changed, but she still remains the same in spirit. Her motivations are mostly the same, and her personality is unaffected by any alterations that are made. I would say that it feels like more so than her father, she is Batman's closest confidant. A lot has changed of the Two-Face character. This Harvey Dent isn't the good man gone bad that he's typically depicted as being. Ironically, instead, he's much more two-faced. He's a self-centered, arrogant jerk who cares more about his public persona than he does about the people he's allegedly attempting to protect. And because of this, I think Bruce's support of Harvey comes off as a little bit hollow. There doesn't seem to be real reason for his belief in him. At first, it felt like this was doing a disservice to this character. Harvey's always had his struggles, but they came from his head, not from his heart. Having him be just as corrupt as his clientele and colleagues made him feel a lot less special to me, and it made his turn to villainy far less tragic. Harvey also doesn't seem to have the split personality here either, which to me is also a major part of the character. His inner turmoil is reflected visually by his affliction. At first, it felt like this conflict was just skin deep, though interestingly enough, this went for a reverse telling of the tale, showing Harvey as corrupt before later revealing a more righteous side. Morals that he once stood by, that he lost along the way, take center stage. And it's that last-minute change of heart that changes him forever. Dent turns his back on an agreement he had with Rupert Thorne, causing his right-hand man to scar the left side of Harvey's face. His appearance is definitely toned down compared to a lot of the other Two-Faces. I would even say more toned down than his original comic counterpart. It's made clear that the scarring isn't just skin deep here, as psychologically, Harvey is torn in two, driven mad by the thought of what others are thinking of him, unsure of what to even think of himself. In turn, his conscience continues to come into play, and it plays against it. Feeling that he's unworthy of justice, Harvey loses control of himself. And in a weird way, it seems to humanize him. He's overcome with guilt and remorse for every action that's led him up to this moment. Upon bonding with his rival Barbara, and realizing how good-natured she is, acting out in the ways that he wish he could, he winds up sacrificing himself to save her, with the DA hopping in front of a bullet meant for the public defender, showing that the man may have lived a villain, but he still died a hero. And let me be honest about this, they lost me in the first half, but they won me back in the second. I would actually be upset if they retconned this and undid it, because this character arc has seen the perfect climax. If they did bring the former district attorney back, I think they'd run the risk of ruining a good ending for a bad guy. Oh, and then of course we get the end reveal of the Joker. It's going to be interesting to see how he exists in the same universe as Harley Quinn, without the two having any kind of ties to each other. There are also villains like Nocturna, Onomatopoeia, the Gentleman Ghost, but they all feel like one-off episodic antagonists. And none of the above leave much of an impression on me personally. Nocturne is a vampire who's not a vampire, but is basically a vampire, hence me referring to her as such. She absorbs the energy of her victims because she needs their power to survive and thrive. Her brother tries to keep her fed, but also doesn't want to risk the lives of others, kind of maintaining a catch and release type of arrangement. But his sister, not knowing her own strength, accidentally kills her brother in an argument. And when she finds out about his demise, she breaks down and waits for the sun to come up to burn her alive. Although ultimately, she's saved by the night. There are a lot of clever callbacks. You get a Grey Ghost Easter egg here, a reference to the 60s show there.
Pow.
Which is honestly probably one of my favorite shoutouts to that show, just because of how much sense it made in the story. On top of that, there's a bunch of surprising cameos. King Tut, or as he's better known as now, Pharaoh, appears as one of Harley's brainwashed henchmen. Killer Croc makes an appearance as a carny. Even Julie Madison gets to be Bruce's flavor of the month at some point. And maybe most interestingly, would-be Robins Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, Stephanie Brown, and Carrie Kelly all make appearances as orphans watched over by Leslie Tompkins. In this episode, the most emphasis is put on Carrie, so if any of these people are to become the second half of the dynamic duo, I think it most likely would be her. But I think equally, if not more likely, is that none of these characters will ever come into play again. And Batman will, well, probably remain solo, just as he did in the early days of his career. In terms of dynamics and characterizations, the characters feel very three-dimensional, although physically they obviously are not. Despite being the hero and the titular character, Batman isn't by any means a perfect protagonist. He's cold and callous, and at times borderline rude to the only person he's close to. He refers to Alfred by last name only, treating him like he's just the help, something he gets called out for by Lucius Fox.
Well, I was raised to treat the staff like people, Bruce. You might want to give it a try sometime.
By the end of the season, the two have gone through so much together, with Bruce almost breaking down into tears, thinking that he lost him on one occasion. By the end of the season, Bruce begins to refer to Alfred by name, silently acknowledging his mistreatment and subtly giving hope for a better relationship between the two in the future. Alfred also mentions on several occasions that Bruce is not well and would probably benefit from some sort of therapy, which if you're a fan of Batman, well, you already know that to be true. This Dark Knight has yet to establish the compassion that the character is famous for, using people as pawns in his own plans. Of course he means well, but the means he's willing to go to do well, aren't exactly, well. He essentially exploits Harvey's mental health in an effort to extort information from him, damaging his own friend's psyche with zero regard. While he does become sympathetic, unfortunately it's a lesson that's learned the hard way, as Harvey's lost in Bruce's pursuit for justice. The season ends with Batman doing the one thing Batman shouldn't do: use a gun. Now, there's certain sections of the internet that seem to be tearing this up, but in my opinion, I don't think that this necessarily breaks his code. Mind you that this moment comes right after Harvey Dent is murdered. Batman takes his vengeance on his gunman by unloading a round and intentionally missing his target at point-blank range. This is an act out of rage in a heated moment. And even then, even at that point in time, he's not willing to take a life or inflict severe injury on a man who's just murdered a friend. This was nothing more than a fear tactic used out of anger. And even after the fact, Batman acts out showing his disdain for guns. So no, by no means does this break the character or his code of ethics at all. If anything, it establishes them. You gotta take into account the circumstances that surround this moment, and also how early he is into his crime-fighting career. A lot of this, and by this I mean the show in general, just feels like the blueprint of Batman. Barbara and her father James are both incorruptible forces of good, and while they're on the same side, they're hardly ever on the same page, with Barbara protesting her father's black and white worldview, desperate to get him to see shades of gray, whereas her father just wants her to see that not everyone is redeemable, and some things are just as they seem. In the end, the two find out that two things could be true. I like that the show doesn't have good guys always being in the right and bad guys always being in the wrong. It's a lot more complicated than that. Sometimes. The season ends with a promising future in sight. Batman and Alfred are working together in a more healthy manner, much more like a cohesive team. Some of the most corrupt officers are now off the force and out of the picture. Some of the remaining GCPD have an understanding with the Caped Crusader, and the Dark Knight's made his pursuit of Rupert Thorne all that much more clear. This is the start of a better tomorrow for Gotham City, and the start of a show that I look forward to following. And if you're looking forward to following that show, and you like this video, and would maybe want to see the second half of this review, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
I ain't messing with no Caped Crusader.
I am vengeance. I am the Knight, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.